there is a sort of deeply apocalyptic tone, I would say, which has taken root on the right. It is this idea that Britain is uniquely sort of at a moment of profound crisis.
They're waiting for the violence to erupt, which they will condemn, but then say, I told you so.
This is a sort of language and tone and terms which are now commonplace, not just on reform, but within the Conservative Party itself. And I think it's disturbing. We know algorithmically the stuff that gets the likes and it gets the retweets is the darker stuff, and which gets darker and darker again in turn. That is a sound, and indeed a sight, which is becoming more and more familiar with each passing week. That was Canary Wharf, the latest place where anti-migrant, anti-asylum seeker hotel protests have taken place, with mums and others from the area taking to the streets, chanting, "What do we want? The boats to stop. When do we want it? Now."
There is an air of crisis, almost of moral panic over what is happening with the small boat arrivals and the migrant hotels. But are things as bad as they seem? And why does it appear that some on the Tory benches are stoking this? Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
Konnichiwa.
Thank you, just same to you. Same to you, pal.
Same to you, pal.
Yeah.
So, back from Japan, good trip?
Very good. Very good, thank you. Thank you for bowing as I came in. I appreciate that.
Well, bowing and scraping.
Indeed so, rightly so.
Which is what you've had written into the contract, which is what I
Quite
must
so.
do now when you arrive. We'll be coming back to Japan later on. But something very exciting we have to alert you to is to the newsagents.co.uk. Yes, we have our own website available from now with in-depth articles. You can listen to back episodes of the podcast. You can hear the thoughts of Mateless, Goodall and Sopel, as if you haven't heard enough of that already.
Yes, so visit thenewsagents.co.uk. We are going to talk about this question of migrant hotels, asylum seeker hotels, whatever you want to call them. And obviously it's something which has bedeviled British politics now for at least a year longer. And we seem to have, with each week, obviously it's been happening in Epping, yesterday in Canary Wharf, each week, more and more protests against the use of asylum hotels. Yesterday we saw all over Twitter protesters accused of trying to break into a hotel, the Britannia International Hotel in Canary Wharf. The Met saying that protesters were making concerted efforts to breach the fencing and access the hotel. Also accused members of the group, many of whom were wearing face masks, families with children, waving flags outside, listening to speeches outside this hotel, Met accusing members of the group of harassing occupants of the hotel and staff and trying to stop people from making deliveries. Officers were forced to step in after flares were let off in the crowd. And look, there is clearly a lot of tension and concern out there about the use of these hotels. I think what is most intriguing and notable is the extent to which many politicians on the right of politics right now, rather than doing historically what politicians tended to try and do in these situations, which was to try and take the froth off a bit, try and lower the temperature a bit, every time this happens, doing quite the opposite, deciding to raise the temperature, increasing the invective, and generally making the situation potentially worse still.
And so, just so that you're clear that this isn't just us sounding off, I mean, let me give you an example of some of the kind of posts on social media over this past weekend. Nadhim Zahawi, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, not seen to be on the far right of the Conservative Party, posted on X the reason why the people of the United Kingdom will revolt. And he was quoting in turn Isabel Oakeshott, who said that police have just banned protests outside the migrant and hotel in Canary Wharf for 28 days. Well, that's not strictly true. The Met pointed out, we have not banned protests outside the Britannia International Hotel. We continue to encourage those exercising their lawful right to protest to do so responsibly. Anyone who crosses the line from lawful protest into criminality can expect to face police action. So you have the Metropolitan Police now correcting what's being put out by some Conservative MPs. Let me give you another example. Neil O'Brien, who's in the Shadow Cabinet, Shadow Minister for Policy, Renewal and Development, posted, "Joke regime, we must end it all." And that was quoting a GB Politics article claiming to show video of migrants at the Canary Wharf Hotel working illegally as delivery drivers for Deliveroo or whoever it happens to be after one day after their arrival. Didn't turn out to be true. And yet the readiness with which people are retweeting and kind of going to arms. Nick Timothy put up a tweet, he's taken it down in fairness to him, where he said it showed an illegal Deliveroo worker getting a police escort and wrote, "This sums it all up. The Home Office pretends to get tough with companies that depend entirely on illegal immigration, but doesn't." And so that got deleted. But
Well, it got deleted because, again, the Met actually were tweeting. I mean, this is a Conservative shadow minister, right? The Metropolitan Police tweeting him saying that isn't true. That there was no police escort for this Deliveroo driver. It was just simply that this person was being attacked as they were trying to get into the hotel and so on. So you've got this. I mean, I think just to dwell a little bit on the examples you cited there, John. I mean, I do think sometimes, and we talk all the time on this show and have done for some years now about the idea of the Overton window moving. That's the idea, the Overton window, basically the sort of acceptability, what is acceptable in politics, the sort of parameters of politics, sort of moving further and further to the right. I think it's not just moving at this point, it's galloping. Fueled and egged on by social media, by Musk, by X, by GB News and others, to the point that you now see shadow ministers and, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nadhim Zahawi, someone who I actually respect and like in lots of ways, but, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer saying this is why the people of the United Kingdom will revolt. Revolt. Neil O'Brien, again, someone generally in the past being considered on the sort of moderate wing of the Conservative Party, talking about the regime. This is the elected government of the United Kingdom, the regime. I mean, this is a sort of thing, if a left-wing party, if a Corbynite party talked in these terms, they would be rightly excoriated and dismissed as student politicians, because this is the language in some ways of student politics, but also of extremist politics, talking about regime and revolution. But this is a sort of language and tone and terms which are now commonplace, not just on reform, but within the Conservative Party itself. And I think it's disturbing.
Yeah, what you almost get the impression is happening is that they are they're waiting for the violence to erupt, which they will condemn, but then say, "Told you so." I mean, we did warn. We did warn that there was a tinderbox atmosphere and that the atmosphere was getting more and more toxic and polarised, and you failed to address the underlying issues that are of concern to the British people. And whilst I don't condone any violence against police, this is what happened.
Yeah, because it will vindicate their worldview.
It will vindicate their worldview, which they're sort of laying the groundwork for. And you've seen, I think, the master of this, who is Farage, who always walks up to the line and never crosses it, where he's ever can be accused of inciting violence or is a kind of, a conductor of it. But at the same time, when he says, "Well, told you so, I did say, I warned, I don't condone this, but the threat, the danger has been there and evident to see for some time." And you feel that some Conservatives are doing that as well now.
Yeah, and what's striking as well is that, if you look at the data on this, if you actually look and actually just are a bit more sober and a bit more level-headed about it, you can see that actually the use of migrant hotels or asylum hotels is way down on the peak. September 2023, under a Conservative government, it was at 56,000. And to be fair, it came down under the Conservative government and has stabilised at roughly around 33,000. Now, I don't for one second want to dismiss people's concerns about the use of asylum hotels. I completely understand. I've reported from them. I've spoken to people in areas where they are, and I completely understand that suddenly, if you're in you're just living your life, and a local facility, in this case a hotel, is suddenly taken over, requisitioned, and suddenly you get 100 people who aren't from the area, many of whom often, young men. I understand that that's can be worrying. It can be worrying. You've got concerns about it. And particularly sometimes if there's association with increases in crime, which there can be sometimes. I totally get it. You feel like your community is changing very rapidly in a way that you haven't consented to. You don't really understand why it's happening, and it's happening really quickly. I completely understand it. That is why it is especially important for politicians, mainstream politicians, yes, to channel those concerns, to hear them, to talk about it, but to do so in a way which does not readily spread, not just misinformation, but conspiracy. And that is what we're seeing, I think, in the tone of what were formerly mainstream centre-right politicians and the Conservative Party. It's not so much talking about it. I think we should talk about it. It's important to not allow the really far-right forces to have a monopoly on those concerns and to exploit them in that way. But to talk about, to readily spread conspiracy and misinformation. We've had Neil Basu, our colleague, formerly of the Met, but now on the crime agents, on the show, talking about how he and many of his colleagues who are still in the Met consider one of the biggest risks to public disorder in Britain, or public order in Britain now, this spread of misinformation, which we see especially on X, or a tone of invective that we see on X, which is raising the tensions even further than where they already are. And what I think is astonishing is that so much of that is at the hands of mainstream, quote-unquote, politicians.
You're absolutely right that people have utterly legitimate concerns about illegal immigration. It does look horrendous when you see these small boats arriving, overcrowded, people wearing life jackets, women and children, risking their lives to cross the channel in this way. It is absolutely unacceptable. I think there is some blame for politicians who, Rishi Sunak, we're going to stop the boats, Keir Starmer, we're going to smash the gangs, and unable to do it, although they've been able to give out glib slogans. People are absolutely right. The other problem with it all is, of course, and this contributes to it, is it's such bloody good television. It's amazing pictures that you'll get on the beaches of near Calais and all the rest of it, of these people jumping onto these little rubber inflatables, and you're thinking, God, this looks terrible. But of course, any TV company is going to be all over social media. It's going to be everywhere because it's good pictures, and good pictures make for, easily inflammable situations, which is what we've got now. And I just think that, it's absolutely shocking the level of people smuggling and that is going on, and the money that is in this industry is grotesque. But at the same time, let's keep it in some kind of perspective, which, as you say, the amount of use of migrant hotels is going down. But I do think it is the most urgent problem that Keir Starmer faces. And I think, frankly, Donald Trump was right when he was in Turnberry saying, if you want to get re-elected, you've got to deal with the migration crisis.
I think it is part of the sort of the dark tone of the reaction on the right. I think is part of a bigger picture, though, which is an increasingly, and you see this on the online radical right, and Robert Jenrick, or someone like Robert Jenrick is a great example of this, but there are plenty of others as well. There is a sort of deeply apocalyptic tone, I would say, which has taken root on the right of British politics over the course of the last year. And it goes far beyond, immigration. It is this idea that Britain is uniquely sort of at a moment of profound crisis in every way, to the point that the state itself also is about to collapse, or society is about to revolt, is about to, and that is not to say or to undermine the idea that, of course, there are profound problems in British society, British politics. We talk about them all the time. But it is this tone of darkness and almost sort of near apocalypse, which has sort of taken root. And it's profoundly bizarre when you consider, of course, particularly on the Conservative side, if you think that Britain is in a state of profound crisis, well, it hasn't happened in the last year. The Conservatives were in office for 14 years. The kind of ability to elide. I saw Mel Stride, for example, tweeting out today saying that Britain is about to be in a debt crisis and it's unsustainable and out of control. Much of that debt, most of the really difficult bit of that debt was added to the national debt over the course of the last 14 years. You can argue about good reason or bad reason, but come on, if we're in a debt crisis, it hasn't just appeared over the course of the last year. And it is so, this dark, this sort of sense of impending doom is bizarre, right? Because if Britain is as broken, as profoundly broken as many on the right are now saying, you got to ask, compared to what? And compared to the past, or compared to other countries? Well, if you compare it to other countries, you would say that most other similar European countries have similar-ish sort of problems, whether it's France or Germany or wherever. The United States also, big problems. And if you're comparing it to the past, well, one of the areas that they're obsessed with, and you see increasingly fevered talk endlessly, is about crime. You know, the idea that crime is so out of control, particularly in London, and they have a particular obsession with London and cities, which again has quite a sort of dark tone to it. The idea that crime is completely out of control. You can barely walk out of the street in London now, according to so many of these kind of radical right accounts, but even accounts within the Conservative Party. You can barely walk down the street without someone snatching your phone or coming to rob you or whatever it happens to be. Well, again, I mean, just look at the stats, right? In 1995, there were 20 million incidents of crime in England and Wales. 20 million. There were fewer than 9 million in 2024. So let's be realistic here. Let's address the problems. Let's soberly talk about the problems and profound sense of tension, which there can be. But what is happening is that this tone of political darkness, I would say, and feverishness is galloping away on the right of British politics. And what it's doing is it's perpetuating itself. Because the way we know algorithmically, the stuff that gets the likes and it gets the retweets is the darker stuff, and which gets darker and darker again in turn. And so you're seeing that kind of radicalization, that online radicalization, which was once at the fringes of the online right world, spread to and take hold in mainstream conservative politics and opinion.
Well, I said in the introduction, you feel that there is a moral panic at the moment, that this is kind of unprecedented and that things have spiraled and spun out of...
Spiral is the right word. There's this
just
sense of
gone
spiraling.
mad. It's gone terribly out of control in the past few... Well, no, it's been a continuation of what we've had for years. It's just the language which is being used now is different. I thought it was interesting, Nigel Farage today, who made this point about there are some people coming to this country. I mean, there are other statistics around, that are being used by the right. I mean, so Robert Jenrick used one of them this morning, saying that in London, 25% of the population are migrant, but 40% of sexual abuse crimes are being carried out by foreigners. And you think, oh my God, so the problem has got way worse. Now, it may be that this statistic is right. It's come from a freedom of information request from a kind of right-wing think tank. So, I don't know what the numbers are, but you can see how that is being weaponized. And Farage was saying today, well, there are some societies where people are just, are more prone to this and they shouldn't be allowed in.
We have to recognise something. There are some people who come from certain cultures that pose a danger to our society. It's as simple as that.
The mistake for the left would be to think just to condemn him as a racist and say that is totally wrong. There are societies that treat women very differently. If you go to Afghanistan today and see what is happening to women living under the Taliban, it is a very different way of life than what you would find if you were a woman living in Western Europe. So there are areas where, and violence against women is much more commonplace in some of these societies. It's absolutely true. What the left mustn't do, or centrist politicians, or those who it's just to say this is complete and utter nonsense, you're a filthy racist. There are things that Farage says which need to be addressed, and that's what he does so cleverly.
Yeah, far better would be to actually go after Farage on some of the detail, which is, for example, again, just sort of completely lacking. I mean, again, at that press conference, he was asked about what you do with migrants when you can't send them back to an unsafe country like Afghanistan. And he says, I'm sorry, I've had enough of this. If you come from Afghanistan, you go back to Afghanistan. I'm done. That's fine to say. But guess what? You know who's in office in Afghanistan? The Taliban. We do not have a returns agreement with the Taliban. We can't fly people, practically speaking, into Afghanistan. Forget about the legal framework. We can't fly them in. What we're going to do? Parachute them in? Just sort of do an airdrop of people over Kabul?
Over Mazar-e-Sharif or wherever.
Yeah, I mean, come on. And this is again the problem with the kind of radicalization of the discourse, is that it happens in its own terms, in its own bubble, in its own world. And reality, well, never the twain shall meet, right? And this is the and I think this is the bigger problem as well, with mainstream conservative centre-right politicians moving, as I say, galloping with the Overton window to what used to be the preserve of the radical right. Because what that means is that what is left for the actual far right? Where do they go? Well, they move even further to the right. And, you can see this in terms of anyone who's been on X recently can see the level of profound racism, which would once have been confined to the darkest corners of the mainstream internet and mainstream discourse, wouldn't have even been in public discourse, is so virulent, so ubiquitous, being rehearsed and rehashed by people who have got shows on television news channels and huge online followings, and certain academics, quote unquote, so repeating and regurgitating this stuff. Let me give you an example. I think it would have been completely beyond the pale anywhere in mainstream discourse for there ever to have been a discussion about whether Rishi Sunak was really English. This is a discussion which has been basically spreading like wildfire across X and across accounts with huge followings on X over the course of the last week, after Rishi Sunak sent a completely innocuous tweet where he did a selfie on Yorkshire Day and said, "I'm just so proud to be from here, from this country." And it was also rehearsed a sort of discourse that went on about 6 months ago as well about whether he was truly English or not. Of course he's English. Of course he's English on any reasonable estimation of what Englishness is. And instead what we have is a discourse talking about kind of actually whether he ethnically is English or civically English and all of this sort of thing. And, as I say, I think what it means is, what that is representative of is a profound radicalization of our political discourse that would once, and that is to some extent happening at the hands of mainstream conservative politicians. And it's also to some extent happening because also I think Keir Starmer and the centre-left is not offering sufficiently robust opposition in ideational terms, politically intellectual terms, to these ideas. All of the energy of politics right now is on the radical right, rather than being on the left or being in terms of opposition. The left doesn't quite know how to respond, let alone the centre-right. And that means that our politics just keeps getting dragged in this direction, which I think is pretty dark in every sense.
But I think that the lack of coherent messaging from the Labour government is really striking. And you see the way the language has zigzagged all over the place on immigration. So 1 minute we're an island of strangers, which had sort of power-like echoes, and the next minute, Keir Starmer saying, "Oh, I got that wrong, and maybe I shouldn't have said that." And it just seems to be this intellectual uncertainty over what the government is trying to say. And I just think that a grown-up conversation, there are skills shortages in this country. There is a declining birth rate in this country. And an ageing population. And probably we do need an awful lot of immigrants to do certain jobs in this country if we're to function as a society. But, the fear for politicians, or the feeling for politicians right now, is they've got to say something condemnatory about levels of migration, and we've got to bring it under control, and we've got to do this and we've got to do that, which are largely difficult to do, and probably not in our economic interests either.
But I think crucially, John, I think the shift has been, and this is where there has been the shift to the radical kind of cultural right, is that the debate in Britain about migration, at least sort of, for the sort of first 20 years or so, I think, of this century, was largely about, though not exclusively, but largely about Britain's capacity to absorb people in terms of our infrastructure, our public service and so on. Again, a perfectly legitimate discussion and debate. And of course, we've been talking about illegal, quote unquote, migration. It's dwarfed by comparison to the size of legal migration, which has taken place, particularly in the post-COVID period. The debate on the right now is less about infrastructure. It's far more power-light, far more like Enoch Powell, the sort of power-light discussions which took place in the 60s, is this idea of, it's not just that we might lose our public services to immigration, it's we'll lose ourselves.
We'll be swamped.
We'll be swamped, not just by people culturally. There's this idea that Britain is losing itself, is losing its essence, is losing its soul. And that is why, in particular, you'll just see online these endless references to London in particular. This idea that, you'll see it from these radical right commentators. I was walking around London today. I could have been in Lagos. I could have been in Islamabad. I could have been in Kabul. Like, really? Have you been to Kabul recently? Because I tell you, it don't look much like Belgravia, all right? So, this is just kind of fevered nonsense, but it is becoming mainstream, this idea that what immigration is doing, which actually has been shown repeatedly as nonsense, what immigration is doing is that Britain is losing its sense of self and its essence and its culture, despite the fact that actually, although it's had its problems, what is remarkable about British culture and Britishness and Britain is its capacity to repeatedly absorb waves of migration and for the children of those migrants to become profoundly British culturally. Rishi Sunak is the best example of that I can think of. And that is why these people go after him and go after Sadiq Khan. It's because in a way they're afraid of them. Because those people are actually the perfect embodiment, perfect riposte to their twisted thinking. Because what are they? Anyone can look at Sadiq Khan and anyone can look at Rishi Sunak and see that they're as English as you or I are. And that's what scares these people.
We'll be back after the break. So I said we'd be returning to what Lewis Goodall did on his summer holidays. So you go to Japan for 2 weeks,
yeah,
and it lurches to the far right while you're there.
Look, basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to get ahead of the Overton window, but it just keeps catching up with me. That's the problem with it. That's
Honestly,
the problem with it,
used to be such a stable place where politics was utterly boring, and you knew it was going to be centrist politician after centrist politician, and suddenly you turn up there, and the far right start doing well.
Well, it's because I like to time my holidays with elections wherever it's possible. You know,
of course.
It has been really interesting being in Japan over the last 2 weeks because it did coincide with their election, so it was in sort of posters everywhere or whatever, and inevitably tried to sort of talk to people about it as best as I'm able to do. They weren't expected to get the poor waiters at the restaurant not expected getting too worried about Japanese politics while we were there. But it's really interesting, and as you say, what's really interesting about Japan at the moment, is the fact that it's interesting at all. You know, Japanese politics. Possibly, I mean, obviously, if you go way back, it was much more interesting. But certainly, since the war or so, boring. Possibly the most stolid, stable politics anywhere in the world. I mean, the Tory party likes to claim, and it just sort of says it just reflexively without ever actually bothering to check. Tory party always says, "Oh, we're the most successful political party in the democratic world." You know, it's like, have you checked with the Japanese Liberal Democratic Party? Because what's amazing about them, the LDP, Japanese LDP, they've been in office for every year but 3 since 1955. I mean, it's astonishing. Like, basically, Japanese politics hasn't really been contested between parties. It's mainly happened within the LDP, this quite sort of centrist, centre-right, small c conservative force, which obviously, Japan has had a transformational history after the war, became the second biggest economy in the world for a while, and so on. And yet, for the first time, really, it feels like that their hold on power is potentially starting to shake partly because Japan for the first time is having a rise of a hard right, far right radical force, this party called Sensito, which just won a clutch of seats in the upper house elections, Japanese diet elections, depriving the LDP of their majority in that chamber for the first time ever. And the really interesting thing about it is that it's both familiar and slightly different. Familiar because they are running on something that feels like their politics is catching up with ours, in the sense that this party, Sensito, starts off as kind of basically a YouTube-only anti-vaccine kind of force, basically has become far more mainstream, used YouTube incredibly effectively, especially with younger voters, and is based on this idea of, you guessed it, Japan first, or Japanese first, and its leader actively praising and basing himself on Donald Trump. So it's another one of these Trump-inspired radical right forces around the world.
So the last time I was in Japan, which was I think 2 or 3 years ago, the ambassador there, who I ended up having a dinner with, was Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff back in the day and is going to play a big part, I think, in democratic politics going forward. But he was making the argument that the reason that the politics of Japan was so popular and hadn't succumbed to the populism that we'd seen in America during Trump's first term, or that we're seeing now in France and Britain and Germany and Hungary and wherever else, is because it's so ethnically pure. It's because immigrants can come and visit, they can come and stay for a little while, but they're not Japanese. And what I felt when I was in Japan was, my God, this is the most kind of, everyone is Japanese. You don't get the diversity that you get walking the streets of London when you're walking the streets of Tokyo.
Yeah, no, indeed. And it has historically low, I mean, by comparison to Western levels, you're right, it has very low levels of foreign born residents and so on, and immigration. But it has been going up. And again, this is where the story is quite familiar to ours, right? It's been going up partly because Japan has a profound demographic problem. Its population is probably about to peak and is expected to decline rapidly over the next 20 years. The government have had to try and do something about that. So the number of foreign residents has gone up from 2.2 million a few years ago to 3.77 million over the past decade. Again, by Western standards, very, very low, but profoundly controversial in Japan. And again, this is why, I mean, this is one of the reasons the LDP is sort of shaking in its boots now, is because of, so this phenomenon, Sansito, has got all of the hallmarks that we see of populist, right-wing populist parties across Europe. They target living standard stagnation. Remember, Japan has had 20 years of stagnation where we've only had 10 because of their particular economic problems that they've had. Food prices increasing. Rice prices are hugely controversial there because they're basically set by the government, and they've been going up very, very rapidly. But then it's got these particularly kind of Japanese elements. And this is where I think it's quite interesting. So one of them seems quite prosaic. It's like tourism. Sansito are running hard on a question of over-tourism because Japan has had, I suppose I'm part of this problem, right, has had this huge boom, mainly from East Asian countries, actually, China and Taiwan, huge boom in tourism over the past 20 years. You only had like 4 million tourists a year in Japan 20 years ago. They've just had, last year they had 37 million tourists. So, you know, all of these tourist hotspots like Kyoto and so on getting completely swamped. Sansito is literally running against them, basically talking about the idea that foreigners are, again, sound familiar back to our previous conversation, that Japan is losing itself to foreigners, even tourists, that they're behaving badly, that they're not respecting Japanese culture. And then you mix it with the darker thing again, which is Sansito talking really quite openly about the idea of Japan needing to be ethnically pure, right? And as you say, John, you know, Japan has a particular, obviously it's got a particular history, right, of imperialism, profound racism, and isolationism, you know. And so it is scaring Japanese political elites that you might have a force which is kind of reanimating and reopening these really old instincts and ideas that have been buried, entombed really in a lot of ways, in Japanese politics for a very long time. Because what's Sansito, I think this is probably quite unique, at least to the Japanese hard right, what they're managing to do is basically create a thread or weave a thread that links tourism and people coming in from the outside with immigration as well. So it's trying to basically set up a politics which is anti-foreigner in every conceivable sense, and is having real resonance in Japanese politics right now.
That is so incredible, isn't it? When you'd think that tourism would be a kind of welcome money spinner. I mean, it's
become Japan's second biggest industry.
Yeah,
so.
And it's not like kind of you know, the protests that you've seen in Venice or Ibiza or Mallorca, where people are saying, you know, Airbnb is driving us out of our homes and we can no longer afford to live here. No one is saying that. It's just we don't want foreigners here.
Well, it's particularly interesting when you consider, and again, this is what's playing in, is a uniquely Japanese thing. It's playing into particular Japanese histories, which is that actually it's not European tourism or even American tourism. You know, top 10 tourist destinations to Japan, I think America's 7th, but the rest, none are European. It's China, it's Taiwan, it's Korea. This is where the explosion comes from. And there is such profound geopolitical tension still, and political tension between these countries, and talk of Japan being sort of swamped by Chinese, Korean, and so on. So it sort of links into sort of old, particular Japanese histories. But it also links back, the sort of rise of the Japanese hard right, goes back, I think, to that first discussion we were having as well. Because Japan is interesting because it is always cited by the British and actually European sort of far right, generally, as an example of the sort of country that we ought to be. As you say, you know, it's ethnically very homogenous, deeply proud of its history, never apologizes for its history. I mean, you know, by comparison to Germany, for example, the Japanese, despite the absolute horrors that were committed in the Second World War in Manchuria, in Korea, and elsewhere, never mind the sort of Western stuff, to some extent apologized for by Japanese politicians, but largely not reckoned with nearly in the same way as happened with Germany and the Holocaust. So all of these tensions are sort of still there. It's a deeply proud country. But the reason the far right in Britain sort of cite it is, and you see this again online all the time, it came up with the Rishi Sunak stuff. If someone like you or I says, of course he's English, they would often say, oh, so Lewis, if you moved to Japan and you were there for 30 years, would you be Japanese? And the answer is, like, no, I suppose I wouldn't. But that's partly because of the way that Japan chooses to view itself and questions of ethnicity. And my point would be to say is that Britain, France would be the same, other European countries, the United States as well, has a far richer understanding of what ethnicity, citizenship, Britishness in our case, can and ought to be. I would much personally rather live in a country where it is considered axiomatic and reflexive that Rishi Sunak or Sadiq Khan or whoever it happens to be are English or are British, rather than living in a much more, for all of its, and it's a great country by the way, I'm not knocking it, for all of its great attributes and merits, rather than living in a country like Japan or China or wherever it happens to be, far more closed and insular countries, which would say, no, you know, this person who is born, even if they're born here, but if they're not ethnically Japanese or Chinese or whatever, aren't Chinese or Japanese. I would much rather live in a country like our own with our understanding of what ethnicity and what citizenship is than a country like that. Do you want to know a fun fact I learned about Japan, John, when I was there? Do you know what they have for their Christmas dinner? I mean, obviously, they don't really celebrate Christmas.
Turkey and soy sauce.
Kentucky
Fried Chicken.
KFC's most popular Christmas meal in Japan, yeah. The Kentucky, they do a whole sort of special selection for it on Christmas Day. So if you ever fancy it, fancy Christmas in Okinawa, which I'm sure you would.
Yeah, I'd quite like that. Well, I spent Christmas, New Year in New Zealand, and we had Kentucky Fried Chicken. First time I'd eaten Kentucky Fried Chicken.
What, they have it in New Zealand as well?
Well, KFC's everywhere, man.
Well, I know, but for Christmas?
No.
Oh, I see. Right.
I was just eating Kentucky Fried Chicken. When was the last time you had Kentucky Fried Chicken?
A long time, I have to say. I think when I was a kid. Kentucky. I said, well, we'd call it Kentucky in Birmingham, not KFC. Kentucky. We always say, fancy a Kentucky? The answer, of course, yes.
You see, that shows you how far your accent has been, you know, southernised.
No.
I mean, you are part of, received pronunciation
Okinawa.
now.
What's you talking about?
Okinawa.
Yeah.
Right,
Okinawa, pal.
We'll be back in just a moment.
Actress Sydney Sweeney came out this weekend that she was a registered Republican. Any thoughts on that?
That who was?
Sydney Sweeney. She's like a very hot actress right now.
She's a registered Republican?
Yes.
Oh, now I love her ad. Is that right? Is Sydney Sweeney? You'd be surprised at how many people are Republicans. That's what I wouldn't have known, but I'm glad you told me that. If Sydney Sweeney is a registered Republican, I think her ad is fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So that's Donald Trump opining on Sydney Sweeney's ad, which we discussed on the podcast when you were away last week. Have you seen the ad?
I have seen the ad, yeah.
I mean, it is an ad which has caused outrage for American Eagle jeans, where it says, you know, Sydney Sweeney has good genes, and of course she's got blonde hair and blue eyes and blue jeans. The pun being on jeans, and Donald Trump wading in to say that he loves Sydney Sweeney. So, you know, and speculating.
I would have guessed that.
Yeah,
I'm not surprised that he loves Sydney Sweeney in all sorts of ways.
Well, 1 Republican, 2 blonde hair, 3 blue eyes, 4 good looking. What's not to like? But I mean, it's an advert that has caused absolute controversy, and it's good to see that there is no subject that Donald Trump won't wade in on.
Yeah, I mean, I was thought, how far does it go? I mean, what, you know, if he discovered, I mean, anybody was a registered Republican, presumably, would that would be enough? Like, presumably, I mean, is that fine?
But Donald Trump has spoken before in these sort of, you know, the kind of good-looking Norwegians. I mean, you know, something that you married a good-looking Norwegian. But I mean, you know, he has spoken in those terms of kind of, you know, he kind of quite likes the area.
Well, no,
look.
but they're really proud of that in Norway. They're really proud of, like, when he was like, you remember when he said, "Oh, why we're having all these people from shithole countries? We should have more people from Norway."
Yeah,
they still go on about that.
Really?
They still talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, not so great if you're from a shithole country.
Well, no, indeed. Yeah,
Nordic.
exactly. Well, quite so. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, so there we are. Donald Trump, he's at 1 with Sydney Sweeney. I'm sure she'll be invited to the White House very soon. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.